excited about this. We want to give them some time, but just appreciate you all being here. This summer is a super summer when it comes to a topic that will take place for the entire summer with all of our classes combined. But I appreciate all of the classes coming down as we look at creationism throughout the summer months. But we're very grateful for Dr. David Murray. God has blessed us with him and his family in our church right now, and we're just so thankful for them. And so we're going to turn it over to Dr. Murray to share with us what God has shared him this week.
All right, well, thank you. Am I on? Can everybody hear me yet? Okay, I think I'm hearing myself now. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit. I have a strange set of topics to talk about this morning. I put up my title here. It's Time, Age of the Earth, and Immunoglobulins. I know that I didn't get to see what Dr. Frisk talked about last week, but I heard it was about proteins and enzymes and those kind of things. And so me being a protein chemist, I spend my day at Mayo mostly looking at proteins, immunoglobulins. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I wanted to get to that topic. But also the official topic was really age of the earth. And so I want to talk a little bit about that also. And so we're going to take a long journey here. And I really would like this to be an open forum where people can ask questions. I know it's kind of big, but if I say something you don't understand or if I lose you in some way, just ask a question. Feel free to ask a question. I know it's kind of intimidating in this size. But I just kind of want to start, and I just want to talk a little bit about time. It's something we're very familiar with. Time is something that we all deal with, right? We have an Apple Watch. We love time. We keep track of time. We do all kinds of things with time. And we always feel like we don't have enough time. I found this picture of this guy holding on to the clock. We always feel like maybe we don't have enough time. But if you think about it, time is something that's kind of sometimes it sounds like an easy concept, but if you really start thinking about it, what really is time? And so if you go and you start to look in things like Webster's dictionaries and things like that, you'll see definitions like this. So Webster says it's a noun, and time is a noun. And it says the indefinite continued progress of existence and events in the past, present, future, regarded as a whole. So there's some sort of order to time, right? But if I think about that definition, it doesn't really satisfy me a whole lot. Like, okay, yeah, all right, so things are moving in time, but what really is time, and why do we care so much about time? I think this is one of the best definitions that comes straight out of physics. One of the simplest definitions that comes out of physics is basically an interval of change. That's why we care about time, right? Because things change. I change my location, I get older, things change, and that's why I care about time, is because things are changing. So here's some of the things I think, when we talk about time, what are the things we say about time, right? Say, well, I'm really pressed for time, right? Well, what do you mean by that, right? I'm pressed for time. There's not enough time in a day. Well, there's the exact amount of time. Time is really there, but what you're really saying is there's a lot of things I want to get done and I can't get it done because the time is limited. You could say, I remember a time when. So you're talking about a very specific point, but you're thinking about some time when something maybe favorable happened or when something didn't. There's another one. Time flies when you're having fun. What do we mean by that, all right? We say it's time for a change, right? But that's a conundrum, right? I just said time's measuring change. Everything's changing, right? The famous philosophers talk about that really when everything is constantly changing, that when you step into a river, the river, before you come out, the river's changed and you've changed because you're a different person than when you stepped into the river. So everything is really unique in time. We say time is a precious commodity, and that is true, and we'll talk about that. And I'm waiting for a time when. So we think about time, but I'm trying to get you to think deeply. Why do you really care about time? And why do we care how old the earth is? And why do we care about any of these things? But what about from a biblical point of view? What is time from a biblical point of view? Why are we here in time? Why do we care about time? So there's no official definition, but this is what I think of, okay? In Genesis 6:3, it says, the Lord said, after we sinned, right, he said, my spirit will not struggle with humans forever because they are flesh and blood. They will live 120 years. Well, why did he do that? Think about that. Why did God do that? And I think this comes to the heart of why we feel the pressure of time. And really, from my viewpoint and from a biblical viewpoint, I think time was a merciful process placed into creation by God to limit the amount of sin that I could do, right? I'm a sinful creature. He doesn't want me to live forever in this sinful state. He doesn't want me to persist in this sinful state. So he put time, some sort of aspect of time, right? Genesis 3:22 says, and Jehovah said, behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. And now let us, lest he put forth his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever. God did not want us to live forever in a sinful state. So he put time into creation in order to limit us. And this is why we feel the constraint of time, right? Time is a limited, precious commodity because we know in the end everybody's going to die. But that was actually a merciful process. From a biblical point of view, it's a merciful process put in place by God so that we wouldn't keep on continuing in this state. Could you imagine living forever in this state with a continued body decaying? Not a good state. So here's my question. And this is really where we feel time. If you and I were not changing, we weren't getting old, we weren't getting wrinkly, getting gray hair, all the things that we don't like about time, and we knew we weren't going to die, would you care about time? Would you really care about what time it was? If you know you're going to live forever, would you care about time? Okay? So those are things to think about. And I'm coming this because I'm going to eventually bring you back to the age of the earth, but you have to think about, well, what is really time and how do we define time and where did time come from? Has time always been here? And I think from a biblical standpoint, no, time hasn't always been here. We know that God lives in a place where time does not exist, right? God's not bound by time at all. He can walk through time just like a person walks through this auditorium. All right, so we have this biblical point of view, okay, what we talked about. The biblical point of view is this, it's a process placed into creation to limit the amount of sin. So from my viewpoint, that's why I see time is really the purpose of time, is to make sure that I don't live forever in this sinful state. We have this physics definition I talked about, an interval of change. And the reason I like that, it's a very simple definition, but what do we know about God? God is what? Never changing, right? God is never changing. This is why time has no effect on God. God does not change, hence he is not subject to time, and we know that. That's why we long to be with God. God is where time doesn't exist, where decay and the things that change that we hate about time are not there. And so that's why I think it's important to think about that. All right. So here's my supposition. If there was no change, if you were the same today, tomorrow, ever, you wouldn't really care about time. You know, okay, yeah, you would care about meeting people, but you knew that if you lived for eternity, a friend you didn't see today, you could go see tomorrow. And so time wouldn't have the same effect that it has on us today. All right, so here is another one that I want to address because it's something we talk about all the time. Infinity, right? The thought that something can go on forever, right? Kids use this all the time. Remember, you had a debate when you were a kid. You'd say, well, I have $1 million, and then I have $3 million, and the kids say, I have infinity dollars. And once you said infinity, you couldn't be topped, right? Infinity was the end of every conversation like that. But infinity is a very strange concept. And actually, I've borrowed this argument from William Lane Craig. Anybody listen to William Lane Craig much? But he's a philosopher, a Christian philosopher, who actually uses this concept when he debates with humanists about the existence of God, that infinity is a very strange concept. And let's talk about that just for a second. So the idea that something had no beginning, no end, infinity. In math, you always ended up doing it. You made that symbol. But did you ever kind of stop and think, well, this seems kind of funny to use this symbol. What am I really saying when I say infinity? So here's some examples of why infinity is kind of a funny thing. So what is half of infinity? If I took infinity and divided it in half, what do I have? I still have infinity, right? that doesn't seem right? I can't take half of something that's concrete in a materialistic world and still have infinity, right? Here's the next one. What's 1/1,000,000th of infinity? It's still infinity, right? So this is what William Lane Craig says, that in terms of practical application in a time-driven world, practical applications, I'm not saying it doesn't have mathematical applications, it does have mathematical applications, but in terms of a practical application in a universe that's infinity old, how would you mark time, right? You have one event from another event, but everything's infinity. There's no beginning, there's no end, so there's no reference point. So time needs a reference point. So he argues this all the time for the existence of God, is that if we're going to say that time is meaningful, and almost everybody knows that time is meaningful, for time to be meaningful, there had to be a beginning. If there had to be a beginning, if the universe had to have a beginning to be meaningful, then we have to ask the question, how did that beginning begin, right? And and I'm going to show you later, the only natural explanation of that is that there was a creator. All right? There was a creator to start this whole process. And we'll talk about that. From the laws of science, it's the only logical conclusion in my mind. So I said, therefore, for time to be meaningful, there must be a beginning. All right? And we all know that. We mark the beginning of our life. The Jews did it from conception. We do it from birth. That's where time becomes meaningful for us, right? If I say I'm a certain age, there had to be a benchmark to where I put that age. And so that's true also in the physical world, that there has to be some sort of beginning point. We see that from a biblical standpoint in the Garden of Eden. After we sinned, God brought time into this creation. You remember, I think the third or fourth descendant from Adam, they named him Enosh, which meant mortal, because I think Adam and Eve started to realize, whoa, wait a minute, we're starting to change. We're not these healthy young people that we've always been. We're starting to see the effects of time. And so they named one of their kids Mortal because they could see that, hey, something's changing. We're not the same we were. We're getting old. We are going to head to the point of death. All right. But infinity is something we can kind of almost grasp, and that's the interesting part. And the Bible talks about that, and I love this. He says that he has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. This was said by Solomon, one of the wisest guys, right? He looked into this thing and he said, yeah, I can almost understand that I'm an eternal creation, right? Have you ever had that experience? This is what I was thinking about the other day. I had a friend one time I knew in college, and I hadn't seen him for 20 years. I went to his door, knocked on his door, and when I knew him, he was an athletic, young guy, very good-looking guy. I knocked on the door. He came to the door. He had a pot belly. He was bald. And the shock, I almost couldn't hide the shock of what I saw, right? Have you ever been in that situation? But why do we find that strange? Why do we find the passage of time strange? G.K. Chesterton talked about this in a book. He's saying, the funny thing about life is that it's not that it doesn't make sense, and it's not that it makes perfect sense, that sometimes it almost makes sense. But there's things that we see that somehow in our heart we know are kind of odd. We feel like, wow, how strange how they've grown. But if we're really just a product of this environment, and time is something that is natural for us, why should we be surprised when things change like that? But there's something in our hearts that longs for eternity, longs to be where God is, where things don't change, where we don't get sick, where we remain healthy. Those things God has embedded into our heart. And that's why we kind of can grasp the concept of infinity. But I love what it says, but yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Because we're creatures bound by time, infinity, somehow we can't. You try to explain to your kids, well, God's always been here. Well, how can God always have been here? It's a concept that's very difficult for us because we've been bound in time. I think when we get to heaven and we're lifted from the bounds of time, we'll understand it better. But I like that verse. All right. This is what God says in Isaiah 43. Yes, and from ancients of days I am he. No one can deliver out of my hand. When I act, who can reverse it? Because when God acts, he acts outside of time. We're bound by time. We can't reverse what God does. And so God's kind of just letting us know that we're bound by time. All right. So now this gets to the science part. So when we're talking about the age of, the reason I'm spending so much time on this is that, okay, so when we're talking about the age of the earth, we're talking about time. We're talking about a change in something, right? So everything that we do to measure the age of the earth goes back to a change of something. And so the first law of thermodynamics is something we need to deal with because it's something scientists all believe is true at this point. And that is in a closed system. So what I mean by that is that if I have a system and I can wrap my arms around it and let nothing in and nothing out, okay? If I can wrap my arms around it and close it, then what we see is the fact that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be changed from one form to another. Sometimes I can make matter into energy, and sometimes energy will go back into matter. But I can't change that, okay? And that's an important fundamental concept. So what does that mean then in terms of creation? All right, so let's go back. So I tried to convince you that the universe had to have a beginning. For time to make any sense at all, the universe had to have a beginning, all right? But what was at the beginning, right? Was there nothing and then something? Is that possible? And that's the argument that William Lane Craig used, that no, we've never, ever, ever in the history of the entire world seen something come from nothing. Something always comes from something. And that's why he says that if the universe had to have a beginning, therefore there had to be a creator who had something in order to create it. All right, does that make sense? That's kind of the argument that he uses against the humanists to say, well, there doesn't need to be a God. But from a purely philosophical standpoint, we've never seen something come from nothing. So therefore, if there was a beginning, there had to be something before that, and that's something we call the Creator, which we call God, right? The Christian God. But that also means something else, that if the universe came into creation, matter and energy had the same birth date. Right? So if everything was created on this one day, you know, the humanists will say the Big Bang Theory, we say God spoke it into existence, but either way, they had the same birth date, right? Everything had the same birth date. Can we kind of agree on that? All right. So my question then is, how does anything look older or newer if we're all created from the same matter that has an energy that has the same birth date? Okay? These are tough questions. These aren't easy questions to deal with. But these are things we're all kind of faced to deal with, right? So really what we're doing is we're looking at differences. The part of the reason that we see ages in the rocks and the trees and all these things is because matter is not homogeneously spread out. I kind of say it's like a cake batter that's not mixed correctly. So if I take food coloring, put it into a cake batter, and I stir it, but I don't stir it to where I completely mix it, then I get streaks of that food coloring in the cake. And depending how I slice it, I can see different streaks because it's not homogeneous. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with dating of the age of the earth. And so people talk about radiometric dating. All right, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. People talk about starlight, rock layers, ice layers. We're going to deal with a few of these, but for sake of time, I'm only going to do two of them. I'm going to do the first two. All right. So radiometric dating, people say, oh yeah. You hear it all the time. Radiometric dating says for sure that the earth is 4.6 billion years old or whatever number that you choose to pick, right? But I just told you that from a scientific standpoint that everything had to have the same birth date, right? Everything had to. So how do we date rocks, right? Rocks are made from elements that had to have been here from the beginning. Well, what we do is we go back and we look at the rocks. The rocks are not homogeneous, so we look at the elements in these rocks and we make a whole bunch of assumptions, all right? And those assumptions is where I think part of the problem is. All right, I don't know if you can see this very well. So let's just talk about the basic principle of dating with radiometric dating. The basic principle is there are certain elements on the earth that aren't stable, all right? They sit there, their nucleus is kind of overexpanded, and so eventually what happens is they'll liberate either a neutron or proton, and they'll change their form, okay? And so we call the unstable the parent, and we call the one that it changes into the daughter. Okay, so it's not like that the parent's giving birth to the daughter, but the parent's changing into the daughter. So in that way, it's sort of a bad analogy, but that's the assumption, is that, okay, uranium, so this example here, so uranium's unstable, eventually goes to lead, right? So the thought is, okay, if I can take a rock and look at the amount of uranium in it, compare it to the amount of lead, I can kind of get an idea of how long that uranium's been in there. But you can automatically start to see, hopefully you can start to see, there's a lot of assumptions made here, right? What are the assumptions that are made? The first assumption that's made, whoops, sorry, let's go back. Which one's back? Okay. The first assumption is that the original number of unstable atoms can be known. So you got to make some sort of assumption, well, how much uranium was in there in the first place, right? So you got to make that assumption, because otherwise you can't make the calculation. Another assumption you have to make is that the rate at which uranium turns into lead didn't change over time, right? That's another assumption you have to make in order to make the calculation. Otherwise, if it's changing, you can't say anything, right? And I'm going to show you how, all scientists are guilty of bias. I'm not saying I'm not guilty of bias, but I'll show you the biases in here. The third assumption is that we know how many of these leads were there to start with, right? And this is the huge problem for radioactive dating, is the assumption how much lead was there in the beginning. If I assume that no lead was there in the beginning, then I'm going to assume that all the lead came from uranium, and since uranium has a very long half-life, it's going to take a really long time in order for that uranium to turn into lead, right? So that's the assumption. So let me go to a textbook. There's a textbook on this. This is not a Christian textbook. This is the actual textbook I found on radioactive dating, and let me just read this section to you, okay? Sorry for reading, but this is the best way I think I can show this. And they're talking about this problem of the fact that I have to know how much lead was there in the beginning. And they admit this is a problem. It says, however, there is one complication. One cannot always assume that there were no daughter atoms to begin with, right? They're saying that one can't assume that there was no lead in that rock when it was created, right? You can't assume that. So it says, it turns out there are some cases where one can make that assumption quite reliably. Well, we'll judge that one. But in most cases, the initial amount of the daughter product must be accurately determined, right? You need to know that, or you can't make any determination of the date at all. And it says most of the time, one can use the different amounts of the parent and daughter present in different minerals within the rock to tell how much daughter was there originally present. So what they're saying is, if I look at other elements in there, I can make some assumptions, right? Some more assumptions on how much was there in the beginning. But this last statement is the one that really caught my eye. Each dating mechanism deals with this problem in its own way. So there's no consistent way of doing this. So each one of the radioactive dating, they use a different assumption and they deal with it in a different way. But then they say some types of dating work better in some rocks. Oh, well, wait a minute. How can that be? If it's a scientific method, and if I'm weighing you, I can't say, well, your weight depends on which scale I'm using, right? That's not something we allow. We'd all like to pick the lower weight, right? Some types of dating work better in some rocks. Others are better in other rocks, depending on what? The rock composition and its age? Wait a minute. I'm determining the age of the rock, but it depends on the age. There's a huge problem here, right? The same textbook then realizes, so what some creationists did is that after Mount St. Helens erupted, right? So one of them is an argon method, argon-potassium method. So argon's a gas. So they say that when the rock's in its molten state in the ground, all the argon's bubbling out. So there's no argon in the rock in its molten state. And when it comes out of the ground, it hardens and it traps any argon that's made by radioactive decay in that rock, right? So that's the assumption, right? So some creationists who saw Mount St. Helens erupt, about 25 years after it erupted, took the lava, cut it out, sent it to a lab, and guess what happened is it came back as millions of years old. Even though the rock, they saw the rock formed in 1980, right? Well, not all of you, some of you are too young to remember it, but I remember seeing Mount St. Helens erupt, and this rock came down and it solidified, right? But this is what the rebuttal was in this textbook. So it made it into the textbook. It said, some young Earth proponents recently reported that rocks were dated by the potassium-argon method to be several millions old when actually they were only a few years old. They were 25 years old at the time that they did this. But this is what they said. But the potassium-argon method, with its long half-life, was never intended to date rocks only 25 years old. Now, wait a minute. They said it's only intended to give you really big numbers. And it says, these people have only succeeded in correctly showing that one can fool a single radiometric dating method when it is used improperly. Now, there was nothing improperly used. They sent the rock. So if they wouldn't happen to know when that rock was created and they sent it in, they would assume that rock was a million years old, because every rock I pick up, I have really no clue when the magma might have formed, right? So if I wouldn't have had that personal testimony, then I would have ended up calling it millions of years old. But they're saying, well, they used the method wrong because the method's not really designed to do 25 years. It's designed to do millions of years. Not a very good, in my opinion, not a very good logical debate. So literature's full of this, different methods. So there are certain volcanic eruptions that happened over time, and they go back and they date this, and you can see that sometimes they're off. So the Mount St. Helens one I'm talking about, some of the other dating methods came back 300 to 400,000 years old, and we know what happened in 1980. So that you can see that there's an underlying assumption problem here. Now, I'm not saying that these techniques are useless and that we should not even consider them at all, but there's so many assumptions here that going back and trying to get the date of the earth on these things is a very difficult thing to do. Okay, so there's many examples of these in the literature. So when you see this stuff, you got to always ask the question. And then they say you should date it. They're trying to be scientific, and they say, well, you should take a rock, and what you do is first you look at the layer it came in, so you assume about what age it came from. Then you choose the dating methods that agree closest with that, but you need 2 of them. But if you do 5 and 4 of them don't agree, then where's my statistician back there? He is. Yeah, you probably wouldn't allow us to do that with statistics, would you? Just choose which data to pick? Huh? Yeah. All right, so the second method. Now, this one is this is a difficult one. So the other one is the starlight problem. Okay, so what they say is that these galaxies that we see in the sky as light are so far away that it took millions of years for the light to reach the earth. Okay, so therefore, for us to be able to see the stars in the skies, the earth or the galaxy had to exist for millions of years. And you know, the idea that the galaxies are far away, I think we all agree with that. Even creationists would agree that, yeah, they are. The universe is vast beyond measure, right? God is incredibly awesome in the way that he created this universe. So the argument goes like this: because the galaxies are so far away, it would have taken billions of years of light to reach the earth. Since we do not see these galaxies, always their light has arrived. Old universe supporters claim that this demonstrates the universe is really billions of years old. But there are some underlying assumptions here also that are actually coming into question. One is the speed of light. Is the speed of light constant? Now you would think, oh yeah, well the speed of light's got to be constant. But the modern methods are starting to show that either it's slowing down or our instrumentation's changing somehow. We're not sure. I don't know enough. I'm not enough in this debate to know which way it's going right now, but something is happening because the published speed of light, it has been changing for the last couple of years, and we're not sure if it's slowing down or whether or not our instrumentation's just measuring it better. So that's one assumption. But this second assumption is the one that's really fascinating to me. We know that time is not a fixed entity. Now, you've probably been tortured with some of this stuff in physics class maybe where, you know, Einstein's theory of relativity, that if I take a clock and I take it up to the speed of light, it starts to slow down, right? And there's these famous arguments of the spaceman. You put him in a rocket, you send him up the speed of light, you send him out for 100 years, he comes back, he's only a few years older, and everything on Earth is thousands of years older. How is that? Well, the rate of change in a substance really depends on how fast things are changing. And when you get closer to the speed of light, the cycle times of the atoms start to change. And so your whole reference gets pushed off into a different place. But not only does how fast something moving changes time, but gravity affects time. People were floored by these experiments. They had atomic clocks, one they put at sea level, one they put on top of a mountain. And what they realized was that they got out of sync. Like, how can that happen? A clock at sea level and a clock up, and then they said, okay, well, let's reverse them. So they took them and they reversed the clock and redid the experiment, and they got out of sync again. The one at sea level was actually going slower than the one that was up on the mountain. So now they're using this. They're building instruments now to measure gravity based on the change of rate of certain functions of the molecules in order to detect the gravity. But that's a fascinating idea. And I think about this. So we're kind of bound on this earth by gravity, right? You can only jump so high. Gravity is going to pull you back down, right? So there is a gravitational field here. But where God exists? God doesn't seem bound by gravity. So hence, in that state, if there's no gravity, time has no meaning again to me. And I think it's just fascinating how it fits into, the character of God and where he lives. All right. This is the experiment that I pulled off. This is one they're now using to actually measure gravitational forces at sea level versus the mountain based on this. And so they have these clocks connected by fiber optics, a 90-kilometer fiber optic, and they're actually using this to measure gravity now because time is dependent on gravity. Who would have thought? That was not in the mind of people long ago. Again, remember, time, that's why I'm saying time is a relative thing. It's not an absolute thing. Like I said, if things weren't changing, none of us would care about time. All right, so here's my example. I told Pastor Gene I was going to do this. I haven't gone through this. So this just kind of shows who is older, me or Pastor Gene. Okay, so let's come up with some dating methods, all right? Let's try the gray hair method. All right? Now, this is in jest, but it's similar to what we're doing with the age of the earth, right? So we know that in general, people who age get gray hair, right? It's a pretty common concept, right? So you might say, okay, if you look at us, I have some gray hair. He probably has more. Maybe Pastor Gene's older, right? Maybe you would say that, right? How about the amount of hair method? I think Pastor Gene probably has his mustache, his hair's thick, right? So we know that people who age start to lose hair, right? They start to lose hair. So let's say we compared, and he has more hair than me. So maybe in that dating method, he's younger than me, okay? Let's try the wrinkle method. All right, the wrinkle method. As you age, you tend to wrinkle, right? And so maybe if you looked at me, maybe you say, I'm more wrinkly than Pastor Gene. In that method, I'm the older one, okay? Or the wisdom method. I won't say who has more wisdom. But we could use the wisdom method and make a conclusion. But what would trump everything? What would trump everything? What would be an absolute trumper to all these methods? Right, if you brought his mom in and my mom in, and they sat here and said, well, gee, I know David Murray was born on this day and Pastor Gene was born on that day. Would any of you question that? No. So this is what you can see in the testimonial method is accepted widely by everybody. Even people who say, oh, the scientific method is the absolute. I can tell you, if you use radiometric dating on chlorine, all right? So chlorine has a radioactive isotope that decays, and you can use the same method applied to uranium, and you get that some of these rocks are 300 years old, right? Nobody believes that. Why? I don't believe that, but why don't I believe it? Because I've got history books that tell me that things are much, much older than that. I'm not 350 years old, but I believe the testimony, right? I believe the testimony. And that's true. As a physician, I know that. I keep talking about that. There are people who have certain things like, I'm not going to pick, every time I pick one, I step on someone's favorite one. So I'm going to make one up that's ridiculous. So patients say, hey, I got moon dust. And I rubbed moon dust on my wound and it got better, right? I can give them all the scientific data. I've learned this in the past. I can give them all the scientific data I want, and I am not going to convince them because of the power of testimony, right? I had a friend one time who said, this is probably why, and I thought it was pretty profound. He said, this is probably why God doesn't spend a lot of time on science in the Bible, because the power of testimony will override any facts that we know. I mean, think about that. The people of Israel, all the mighty acts that they saw God do, and yet they still walked away, right? It's the power of testimony that really, really does solve these kind of problems. And I think that's important for us. So where do we go for testimony? This is where the biblical dating came from. James Ussher spent a tremendous amount of time going through the scriptures, trying to figure out from the genealogies how old the earth would be based on the biblical creation. This is just one example of a chart that he's making just before the flood, trying to line up all the dates. And from that, he gets about, this is where we get the idea that, 6,000 years old, somewhere around there is where the earth is. And so that's the power of testimony. But you got to believe the witness, right? If the power of testimony depends on the witness. Some of us, like me, I believe God, I believe the Bible, I believe he wrote it. So that power of that testimony really overrides, I'll admit, it overrides what I see in science, okay? All right, any questions on it? Because now I'm going to switch gears to immunity. I'm going to jump like majorly on you now. So I just want you to see is that when you're faced with these things, that the scientific method depends on direct observation, right? And nobody's lived long enough to see the creation of the world. If it were 4.6 billion years old, no one saw it. So there's no power of direct testimony here. It's all inference. And that's not what we allow in science. I have to directly observe something from me in order to actually state it as truth. All right, I'm going to switch now. This is something I work on every day, and I think these are fascinating. And immunoglobulins are a huge problem for evolution. Now, I didn't know this when I started, but I started reading the history of immunology because I'm fascinated with the history of medicine, and now I realize that these are a real problem for evolution. So what are immunoglobulins? So this is a structure of them. Look at them. They're the second most abundant proteins floating in your serum right now. In your blood, you've got immunoglobulins circulating. There are literally thousands of them in there, thousands of different ones in there. And what do? Okay? As I said, they're the second most abundant part of your serum, but they're part of your immune system. All right? When you get sick, the other name for immunoglobulins is antibodies. You have antibodies. You can hear people talk about these things. And to put them in modern technology, they're actually smart bombs. This is why I study them as a physician. They're smart bombs. And what do I mean by that? They're like hound dogs that can sniff out their targets very well in your body. If you look at the structure here, this is the structure. So they consist of this two proteins. We call this one the heavy chain. It's longer. And this lighter one we call the light chain. And this part of the molecule is the signal to bring in the army, basically. It's a signal to bring in the army. It's also very much species dependent. I can look at this and say, I can tell if that immunoglobulin is human, sheep, whatever species. So they're very species specific, okay? This end is the target region. This end is made, and it is specific for whatever it's looking for. So if it's looking for a bacteria, this end of the molecule can find that bacteria in the sea of hundreds of other proteins, all right? They're amazing. And they'll stick to those things and then send signals to bring in the army. So they're really like smart bombs, okay? And how are they made? So this is kind of interesting. So how they're made, so what I'm showing here is, let's say you get sick, you get a bacteria that invades your body. So what happens to that bacteria? The first thing that happens is it'll bump into one of your immune cells called a macrophage, and that macrophage will eat it. They'll say, oh, you're different, so I'm going to eat you. And it eats it, and then it just rips it apart. It just takes that poor bacteria and just rips it into shreds. And it takes pieces of that bacteria and displays it on its surface, basically saying, who recognizes this piece of protein, right? So you have white blood cells in your system, T cells, and they come along and they bump into this macrophage and say, hey, I recognize that piece of protein. That's foreign. That's not us. Let's do something about it. And these T cells will then convince these B cells to make these smart bombs to go find the rest of them. It's unbelievable. It's like a spy novel. It's like a war novel. The immune system is just as good as any war movie you've ever red or anything like that. There's espionage, there's secret cloaks and daggers. But anyhow, so these guys tell the B cells in your body, okay, start making these antibodies. And this is the principle behind vaccination, right? I give you a little bit of the dead bacteria or dead virus, and I give it to you, and I teach your body what it looks like so it recognizes it later, all right? Then what happens is as they go, okay, all right, we're under attack. We need to make factories to make smart bombs. And that's what it does. So it takes these cells that recognize this, and they start to proliferate. They make more of themselves, and they send them out, and they go out and they attack, and they get on your bacteria. And then what they do is once they stick to the bacteria, you're not going to believe what they do. This is what they do. This is a picture of a particle coated with this. The antibodies come in, and another set of proteins come in and drill holes into the bacteria wall and make it leak out all its internal organs. Pretty gruesome thing, right? But that's what it does. And this is, you can kind of see here, this is a side view. You can see the hole that was drilled into this particle. These aren't bacteria, but these are sensitized like it. And this is exactly what happened. And you make this 10 nanometer pore, and everything just leaks out, and the bacteria dies, and eventually you clear your infection, okay? But they're unique. This is where the problem is for evolution. So in natural selection, what you say is, well, okay, if I have a good immune response against some bacteria, I pass that on to the next generation, and through natural selection, this is what happens. But immunoglobulins aren't made that way. Immunoglobulins are the only cell in your body that take your original DNA that you got from your mom and dad, and they rearrange it. So they don't keep it the same. So when they rearrange that DNA, there's no way for you to pass that on to the next generation, okay? And so this just shows you what happens. These B cells come out, they find these antigens, and they go off and won't spend too much time. They make these factories, basically, that make these smart bombs that go out and clear infection. And so people went in here, and so this is why I started looking at these. I'm fascinated by them. So what happens is there's a set of genes in your DNA that code for that smart bomb area that can target its antigen, right? The part that can find the bacteria. We call that the variable region. And there's some genes, so we know how many genes there are now. There are 150 genes that it can select from on both the light and heavy chains. And so you just start doing statistics, you get the number of combinations, and you end up with this idea that you can make 2 times 10 to the 12 antibodies. And the theory has always been that this is a random process that just randomly selects from here, there, creates all these B cells, and they sit out there waiting for it to happen. But this is an example when you're a Christian, you're like, what? Wait a minute, this is such a complex system. There is no way this is happening by random chance. And so this is where I started looking at these things going, there is no way this is happening by random chance. So how are immunoglobulins a problem for evolution? We're running out of time. I got to keep... So as I said, my immunoglobulins are not passed on to my children. So if I happen to be really good at clearing strep infection, that's really not passed on to my kids, right? That's something that is not passed on. The other problem is, and this is what they found, they say the human immune system is independent of bacterial changes. So if evolution is true, the bacteria over here evolving, making new proteins, I'm over here evolving, making new proteins. If it were true, yet I can recognize them when they invade, even though they've changed. A bacteria that I've never seen before in my life, my immune system can recognize it. Well, in an evolutionary process, that's a problem, right? Because there should be, how did I know that bacteria was going to mutate that protein, right? I had no clue. The other problem is that human antigens like plastics and things that were created that aren't really of nature, my body can recognize those also. Well, how did that happen? If evolution was true and natural selection is the processes by how did the immune system have the foresight to know that someday that men would make this particular plastic and it would cause an immune response? It's a problem for evolution. That's why I say human immune system can recognize man-made materials that were never part of nature. Well, okay, through natural selection, how does that get passed on? This won a Nobel Prize, so people came to realize this, and I didn't know this when I started working in this field, so I started reading this, and I'm like, are you kidding me? This is what they said? This is what they said. Okay, so think about this. So this is what he said. This is the person who won the Nobel Prize for this, talked about this. He said, since there is a difference in orders of magnitudes in the generations of bacterial viruses in man, meaning bacteria are dying a lot faster than you and I are. So in terms of evolution, they're changing faster. If evolution is true, they're changing faster than us, right? So because they're dying out so quick. Natural selection could never cope with the new virulent mutants, meaning new bacteria that could actually come in and kill you. Because they mutated faster, they should be able to win out over us. That's what they're recognizing. Something happened here. So they say development of the immune system had to depend on new evolutionary mechanism based on the Promethean principle. Sounds very scientific, doesn't it? You say, oh, well, it's the Promethean principle. I had no clue. I was like, what are they talking about? I work in this field, like, what are they talking about? So I had to finally look up. I just looked up this morning with my cousin. I'm like, who is Prometheus? He was the god of foresight, right? So they're saying, well, somehow this evolutionary had foresight to know this was coming. And they name it Promethean and they walk away like it's solved. This is what they did. And they win a Nobel Prize for this, right? So here's my problem. A random, non-caring force that we call evolution has compassion enough on the human race to give it foresight to keep types of bacteria that are coming in the future to keep us alive. I think that sounds kind of like a different force that's compassionate, loving, caring, who does have foresight, right? Evolution, by definition, does not have foresight. All right, so I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to close with this. And so this just brings me back to Romans chapter 2. If you think, why all this fuss about the age of the earth? I mean, if you look at it from an objective standpoint, you have to stand back and say, well, none of us really can tell. We're trusting the Bible. I fully admit that I'm trusting the Bible to get the age of the earth. They're trusting in other principles, but why all this tension, right? Because the implications of saying whether there's a God or not, right? If there's a God who does have foresight, who does know everything, then you need to answer to that God, right? And that's what people don't want, right? Romans chapter 2 dealt with that, right? For the invisible things of him since the creation of the world are clearly being perceived through the things that are made. Look at those immunoglobulins. Those things are unbelievable. Even his everlasting power and divinity, that they may be without excuse. Because that knowing God, meaning you should look at this and understand there was at least a creator. They glorified him not as God, neither gave thanks, because vain in their reasoning and their senseless heart was darkened. Professing to become wise, they become fools, and changed the glory of an incorruptible God for the likeness and image of corruptible man, and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. I'll close with this. Chuck Missler said this, and it struck me one day. I was listening to him. He said, our culture has created the worst idol ever. And what he mean by that is that in the past, you would create an idol and say, this is my idol. It's wood. You at least give it some thought. It was caring. It had some human characteristics at all. But in our culture, we've created this new God called evolution, random force. We say, this force has no compassion, has no forethought. It's random, it's cruel. What an idol to create. It's the exact antithesis of what we know about God. So, okay, I'm gonna close with that. But I hope you found this kind of fascinating. And I know that, especially for the young kids going to college, you're going to get beat up sometimes by your professors on these things. Because they'll throw things, they'll just say, oh, you haven't heard about Promethean evolution. You're like, well, you're right. I haven't heard about Promethean evolution. And honestly, they don't even know what they're talking about. I mean, I'll just speak from experience, right? I've had to do that a few times in med school where you don't really know what you're talking about, but you just say it because you got to look smart, right? So anyhow, okay, let's close in prayer. Well, dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time that we can spend thinking about you. And Father, I'm just overwhelmed by your compassion and kindness towards us as I think about these things. And Father, I want to give you glory and honor for the way that you've created us and the way that you've been kind to us. And you've provided not only this earth, but a way to escape the very sin nature that we have. And we thank you in Christ's name. Amen.